May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. I would first like to pay my respects and acknowledge our traditional owners of this land, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and elders from any other communities who are with us here tonight. It is amazing to see such a big crowd with us tonight. It is our honor to be part of the launch of one of many great books written by Dave Andrews, The Jihad of Jesus. What a lot of you may know is that Dave is a Christian educator, an author, activist, and community worker. However, a lot of you may not know or do not know that Dave Andrews is one of the most humble, kind-hearted people you would ever meet. He is also a dedicated husband, father, grandfather, and a great friend. The word jihad is an Arabic word meaning struggle. Dave's jihad is to bring people together. Dave's jihad is to find a common ground between two major religions. The healing process of human beings firstly begins by acknowledging the importance of justice. To me, this book is all about acknowledging that injustices were conducted by both parties. Dave further assists both Christians and Muslims in understanding how to also move forward from these injustices by reaching a common, sacred, non-violent, just society. When Dave passed this transcript across the table at the coffee club in West End, I read the title and I looked up towards Dave with wide open eyes and a dropped jaw. Then I busted up laughing and I said, "You will get shot." However, I then continued and stated, "But don't worry, Dave, I will be your bodyguard. I will protect you." This is the relationship that every Muslim and Christian can have. This book will assist a lot of people from both faiths to have that deeper understanding, an understanding that derives from both our traditions. Please welcome our first speaker for tonight, Nora Amath, who is a Muslim activist, educator, community worker, and co-founder of AMARA, which stands for Australian Muslim Advocates for the Right of All Humanity.
Thank you, Salam. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most compassionate. Can I also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on whose land we're meeting today? Can I also start by extending the Islamic greetings, which is Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, which means may God's peace, blessing, and mercy be upon you all. What an honor to be here, Dave. Here we are, 8 years later, my friend. And to think that I did not want to meet Dave at all. And if you hear my story, which I'll be sharing with you shortly, you'll understand why. My story starts in April 2001 in the Redlands, in a tiny little suburb called Capalaba. My husband and I had just built our house, our first house, and we were moving into the house with our 2.5-year-old boy and our, about that time, 9-month-old little girl. And during the building process, we would actually go and visit the home site, the building site. And while we're there, we engage in conversations with our neighbors who are also building their homes. And one of those conversations, and I like to call it the fence talk. We had the fence talk, as most new neighbors would. How high, what color bond, wood, what color, etc., etc. And in that conversation that we had with one another, we decided that we weren't going to erect any fences because we all had young children. So these are basically strangers who only met, at the site. But we decided intentionally that we wanted to create something different because we all had young children at that time, that we were going to allow our children to jump from house to house, from yard to yard. And it also gave, I guess, the adults an opportunity to socialize. And it really brought about this kindred spirit of hospitality that we showed one another, of care, and most of all, of responsibility for our neighbor. It didn't matter to my neighbors that we were devout Muslims. It didn't matter to me or my family that they were Catholics, Anglican, or Greek Orthodox. But then September 11th, 2001 happened. And I remember that morning very clearly. My husband and I were getting ready for work, and we usually turn on the morning news just to see what was happening. And I remember the images of the towers getting burnt, the images of the towers collapsing. We have never forgotten those images. How could we? It was played and played and played and replayed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It didn't matter which channel you turned to. It was constantly playing. Those horrific images are still seared into my memory. I remember I turned to my husband that morning and I said, the fences are going to go up. There was no way that our very still fragile relationship of building, that connectedness with one another of just 5 months could surely withstand the horrific, tragic events that had occurred in America. But the fences didn't go up. And I thought, okay, we'll give it a few weeks, because then it'll sink in. And what will also sink in and what they'll realize is that our eldest son, who was 2.5 at that time, shared the same name as the most wanted man at that time, Osama. The fences didn't go up. In fact, the fences didn't go up, and the kids still played with him, even though his name was Osama. Did the fences go up? Yes, they did, eventually. But only after my family and I had actually moved to be closer to Underwood, to go to our children, to be closer to our children's school. I was so inspired by that experience with my neighbors that I honestly decided that I was going to go on a one-woman campaign and basically to share with anyone my faith. And I thought, if all it took was for somebody to meet a Muslim, and at that time, I think the census showed that Muslims were about 1.7% of the Muslim population, the chances of people meeting a Muslim would be quite rare. So I was going to go out there and I was going to introduce everyone to a Muslim. I was going to share my faith and how I live it, by the grace and compassion of God. And I thought I was going to be embraced, as I have been embraced by my neighbors, who are not only my greatest supporters, but defenders of bigotry against their family, their friends, and their colleagues. I had some great moments of embrace. I had some great moments of openness. I had some great moments of understanding. But I also had some very ugly moments of narrow-mindedness, of dogma, of bigotry. So much so that after 5 years, I said enough. I just couldn't do it anymore. During that time, I was asked to meet with Dave by a Brisbane City Council community development officer. And her introduction or her, qualification for meeting Dave was that he's great. He's a devout Christian. You'll love him. And I honestly said no. Because some of my darkest moments on that campaign for everyone to meet a Muslim, some of the darkest moments, unfortunately, came from Christians who were there not to understand or to listen with an open heart, but really to bash a faith that I was very passionate about and wanted to share, who wanted to convert me. And I honestly thought, okay, if he's a devout Christian, he was going to want to convert me. So here I stand in West End, where my story with Dave starts and hasn't ended. It started on the 17th of September, 2008. I actually went back and I looked it up through our emails. Right here on Boundary Street at the Coffee Club. The Coffee Club's going to get quite a bit of a plug through Salam and myself tonight. In fact, our very first project occurred also here in West End, where we decided that we were going to celebrate the end of fasting at the Uniting Church, wherein we held a feast for both Christians and Muslims to come together to reflect on the shared concept and values of fasting and what it meant and how that informs how we live our life as both Muslims and Christians. So we started our relationship on common ground, what we have in common, and used that really as a place to build respect and trust, to be able to launch then into the more difficult topics, such as the theological understanding of Jesus, and we had quite a number of those sessions, and of course, jihad. So it's only natural that after 8 years of discussion, that Dave would reflect on both of these topics and appropriately title his reflections, The Jihad of Jesus. Not only is it a provocative title, it is a provocative read. I have to admit that I was quite nervous when Dave sent me the manuscript to review, and he was quite nervous when he sent me the manuscript to review. I recall that. Because Dave's books always challenge me, especially the Beatitudes. And I knew that this book wasn't going to be any different. It made me really think, and it made me really reflect on my own faith and its history, and the ugly bits included, and how that informs how I now live my life as one in submission to God. And all too often I'm told at speaking engagements that religion is the root of all conflict in the world. And I would always disagree and knew that religions could be a source to overcome conflict. However, until now, I didn't have a resource manual to constructively as well as systematically embark on such peace building. Friends, there is a lot of ugliness out there, and fear too. When people are fearful, they lash out, as we have seen over the last few weeks. It is easy to just walk away and remain oblivious to that all, or cry, as Salam and I have done a few times. Or we can take advantage of this moment, harness that fear, and propel that energy into building understanding, grace, mercy, and compassion. Yes, this is a book that we can simply read and shelve on our bookshelf to gather dust with our other books, or we can meet its challenge, like what Francis of Assisi, Basha Khan, Lama Gawawi, or Imam Muhammad Ashafa did. By approaching nonviolent struggle through the embodiment of Jesus, we can, and I quote, denounce the exploitation of the poor by the rich. Number 2, denounce oppression of the powerless by the powerful, and actively advocate liberation of disempowered groups of people. Number 3, advocate communities with leadership that would serve rather than oppress. 4, create communities committed to doing justice to the marginalized and the disadvantaged. And finally, 5, if we were to follow Jesus, we would demonstrate active, radical, sacrificial nonviolence to free people from the cycles of violence. So here I stand before you as a devout Muslim, proclaiming that the embodiment of Jesus will be the basis for my jihad movement. The movement for the radical, or as Dave states in the book, and I quote, a strong yet gentle nonviolent struggle for reconciliation and peace. I hope that this will also be your jihad moment. Thank you.
It's great to see so many people here, and it's great for you to be among us and to hear our stories and to share something of the deepest longings of our heart, Christians and Muslims together. I too want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and deeply value the welcome that we've received from elders in this community. I'd also particularly like to begin today by acknowledging my partner and companion over the last 45 years, my dear wife, Angie, who was prepared at the age of 20 to sell our house, to give everything away, and to go to Afghanistan and begin a journey of trying to seek to live our lives in a way that engaged the profound issues of poverty and violence in our world. Angie and I first met Muslims when we went to Afghanistan in 1972, and we found them to be cheerful and respectful people. And when we came back to Australia in 1984, Angie and I were involved in resettling refugees, many of them Afghans, many of them Hazara from Afghanistan, and we found them flexible and adaptable people. So I never thought I'd find myself talking about being a Christian reaching out to Muslims through dialogue seeking peace, because we just related to our Muslim friends as friends, not as Muslims, until 9/11. And everything changed. And in the identity politics of terror and counter-terror, we found ourselves defined as Christians over against our Muslim friends. And the challenge has been for me to find a way of reaching out to my friends across the chasm of division and suspicion. As I thought about it, I thought I needed to take significant and positive steps to reach out to my neighbours. The first thing I did was visit my local mosque in Princhester Street in West End. I'd never been there before. But once 9/11 had happened and I knew that we were going to be caught up in the propaganda wars, I went the next Friday down to the mosque and asked if I could pray with my Muslim neighbours as an act of solidarity in the face of the propaganda that would divide us over the coming years. The second thing I did was look for Muslim colleagues with whom I could work. And when I found Nora and Salam and Shama and all their friends in Amara, I knew we'd found some people that we could work with to begin to rebuild the bridges that the extremists were blowing up daily. The third thing we did was organise a mixed gathering of Christians and Muslims to come together over an evening meal at the end of Ramadan. And we met in the West End Uniting Church Hall, as Nora was alluding to, and we had mixed tables of Christians and Muslims talking about prayer and fasting and what they learned from their traditions. It was very easy to get the Muslims to bring halal food. It was a bit more difficult to get the Christians just to bring soft drinks. But we managed to get together and eat and drink together and share what we'd learned from our respective traditions. The fourth thing that we did was begin to promote as many empathic interfaith engagements as we could, even in the face of great animosity and hostility. I can still remember Nora and I going up to the Sunshine Coast to speak at a church up there about how Christians and Muslims can live in peace. You know, just a motherhood conversation that would not be controversial at all. When we arrived there were already a mob of people there placarding and, you know, waving their fists and with signs, resist Islam. And I said to Nora, do you really want to do this? And she said, well, we've been praying that we'll be able to engage a broader range of people. And the broader range of people came to us. So we had the opportunity to engage with Reclaim Australia. The fifth thing we did was listen intently and attentively to one another, so we would be open to what God could teach us through one another. We have a strong conviction there's only one God, that God is bigger than our religion, and that God can speak to us through all religions and none. The challenge for us is to be humble enough to learn from one another. The sixth thing that we did was to publicly share what we were learning from one another. And I shared about the Bismillah the spirituality of the Bismillah that my Muslim friends shared with me. And I was able to do that through Facebook during Ramadan. And then it became a little booklet that was published, and then the Radio National did a whole program on it, and it evoked quite a response. Nora, on the other hand, when we launched the Plan B series here, talked about her growing understanding of the radical theology of Jesus. So we began to share with other people what we were learning from one another about our respective traditions. Bismillah spirituality and radical theology. The seventh thing we did was train some emerging leaders in non-violent conflict resolution and interfaith community development. And our friends like Salam have been a part of that with us. The eighth thing we did was organise creative interfaith demonstrations of solidarity with those who had lost loved ones in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and with those who faced being scapegoated here in southeast Queensland. So rather than get out on the streets and be reactive in our demonstrations, we gathered together for prayer, we thought creatively about how we could respond to these things, and we deliberately developed creative rather than reactive responses to begin to turn the cycle of violence into a cycle of non-violence. One of the things that we did during the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was gather together with Jews and Muslims and Christians together and say, look, we've got to get beyond the blame game and we've got to recognise the humanity of everyone. So we bought 1,000 carnations and put the pictures of the victims of that conflict on those, told their stories, and went in teams of Christians, Muslims and Jews together into town and gave out these flowers and invited people into a conversation. Rather than yelling and screaming at the crowd. And it just opened up a deep reflection on the wound of this ongoing conflict. The ninth thing that we did was begin a conversation between faith-based aid agencies that we are associated with about how we could help each other use our sacred texts to educate our constituencies for justice and peace. I've for a long time been involved with a Christian agency called Tear Australia, and Nora's involved with Islamic Relief. And just recently we've got together to have a conversation about how can we use our sacred texts with our constituencies to get beyond charity, to giving of alms, to actually educate our constituencies around justice and peace. And how can we share our resources to do that? And this has begun a really beautiful process. The 10th thing that we are doing is advocating the Jihad of Jesus as a handbook for reconciliation and action, a do-it-yourself guide for all Christians and Muslims who want to move beyond the so-called clash of civilizations and struggle for justice and peace non-violently, side by side. Nora says that reading the Jihad of Jesus was like walking down memory lane. 7 years of patchwork discussions were woven seamlessly together into this beautiful manuscript. We feel this represents us and our journey together in our understanding of one another. And every word in here has been, that I've written has been read by Nora. And you can see that in the manuscript that I'll make statements sometimes and she offers a dissenting view. And we think that's really important. This is a work in progress. Next edition probably will be more seriously corrected by that conversation. The key messages of the Jihad of Jesus are these. We're caught up in a cycle of so-called holy wars. Though these intercommunal conflicts are endemic, they are not inevitable. Depending on our understanding, our religions can either be a source of escalating conflict or a resource for overcoming intercommunal conflict. To be a resource for overcoming conflict, we need to understand that the heart of all true religions is open-hearted, compassionate spirituality. In the light of an open-hearted spirituality, We can reclaim the word jihad from the extremists who have misappropriated it as a call to a holy war and reframe it, as Salam said, in Quranic terms as a sacred, non-violent struggle for justice. And we can reconsider Jesus, as he is in the Gospels, not as a poster boy for Christians crusading against Muslims, but as a strong but gentle messianic figure who can bring Christians and Muslims together. In the book, we talk about many examples, contemporary examples of Christians and Muslims who are engaged in a non-violent jihad for change, who are collaborating and cooperating with each other and working for peace and justice. To conclude, let me say this. We dream of a great society of small communities cooperating to practice spirituality, empathy and harmony. We dream of vibrant neighbourhoods where people relate to one another genuinely as good neighbours. We dream of people developing networks of friendship in which the private pain we carry deep down is allowed to surface and is shared in a culture of acceptance and respect. We dream of people facing our difficulties, discerning the problems, discovering the solutions, and working together for personal growth and social change according to the example of Isa and in the spirit of the Bismillah. And we dream of every congregation, church, mosque, temple and synagogue in every locality acting as a catalyst to make our dream come true. Each of us who feel inadequate need to realise our capacity to act. And each of us who feel afraid need to realise our courage to act. Each of us who feel impotent need to recognise the potential of our actions. And each of us who feel insignificant need to recognise the importance of our actions. Every act of truth is a victory over deceit. Every act of love is a victory over hatred. Every act of kindness is a victory over violence. And every risk a person takes to make a stand with grace for justice and peace is a victory in our strong but gentle jihad to make our dream of a better world a reality. Thank you.
Please put your hands together for our next speaker, Jason MacLeod, who is a Quaker, and he's also an academic advisor for the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict in Washington, D.C.
Greetings, friends, jihadis. I want to also acknowledge the traditional owners of this country. I've come from Manala tonight on Yugarabal land, and travelled towards Turrbal country, and it's a pleasure to be here with you, and a real honour and privilege to be here to help launch your book, Dave. I want to acknowledge my fellow jihadis on the panel. I want to acknowledge all the Christians in the room, all the Muslims in the room. I want to acknowledge the agnostics, the atheists, and all the people of other faiths and traditions with us. I'm hoping that in reading this book, and even tonight, we might consider the deep meaning of what jihad really is, and that if you're not a jihadi, then you might consider this as your newest vocation. To begin with, I want to tell a brief story that explains something of why I'm here. When I was 19, I spent some time in occupied West Papua. It wasn't my first time, it wasn't my last time there. And I travelled from West Papua to the Moluccas. I was a young person in search of adventure, and I'd always had a sense of the presence of a divine mystery. But I was against religion, against organised religion. Anyway, in the island of Tanati, in the northern Moluccas, a place that later erupted in extreme violence between Christians and Muslims, I spent time in this village on the slopes of a volcano and surrounded by cloves and nutmegs. And there was an imam there, a Muslim scholar and preacher, and he'd just come out of 3 days of fast prayer and fasting. And I was profoundly affected by my time in Indonesia. For those of you who've been to Indonesia, and for those of you who've travelled to Islamic countries or Muslim countries, you'll know that you're surrounded by the call to prayer five times a day, and every time I hear it, it's a reminder. What do I stand for? What do I believe? What is God calling us to do? And so I found myself becoming interested in Islam. I'd come to the conclusion that if I believed in God, that I couldn't continue to make things up as I went along. And we sat down with this imam, and we were together, and he told me some of the stories in the Quran. And I said to him at one point, maybe I should convert, maybe I should become a Muslim. And he said, well, you could. And then he said that God is like a mountain. And on that mountain, there are many, many paths to the summit. He said, you were brought up in a Judeo-Christian context. Maybe you should go back and explore your own tradition, explore your own context where you came to faith. I think back to this imam a lot, and I think what profound hospitality he extended to me. Open up this space in my heart to consider the other. And Dave's book does exactly that. There's very few spaces in this time that we live in for us to come together and deeply meditate and deeply appreciate one another's traditions. And this book creates this kind of holy ground for us to engage in this rich dialogue with one another's sacred texts. And in writing this, Dave's offered a tremendous gift to all of us. But Dave is also clear. He's very clear-eyed and very aware of the horror, of the violence that religion has incited. And in fact, the first third of this book is like a smack around the head, where, he uncovers the violence of Christianity, the violence of Islam, what's been done in the name of those religions. He doesn't shy away from that. Indeed, it would make people, evangelical atheists, like Christopher Hitchens, really proud and, scream, "I told you so! That's right!" But just as you're about to scream, "Enough, no more, I can't tolerate it," Dave moves on. And he looks at the deeper underlying message in both Islam and Christianity. And at the heart of that message is jihad. Now, there's an Australian prophet who speaks about jihad. It's not Dave. In fact, this man doesn't even have a beard. It's very unprophet-like. And he tells a parable. He tells a parable that involves the mosquito coil. Now, I grew up in North Queensland, we have mozzies in North Queensland the size of small potty calves. So I'm very familiar. I'm going to light it. I'm very familiar with the mosquito coil, and it's a kind of aromatherapy for me. So, if for no one else's sake, I'll do this for my own. So Lunig tells this parable about the mosquito coil, and I'll just pass this mosquito coil around.
Do you want me to split
Yes. Look, it's an art to splitting the mosquito coil. There we go, Neil. Just pass them around. And he tells this story of a factory where the mosquito coil is made. Now, the funny thing in this factory, a whole lot of people were employed, and their job was to take to look at each coil and to make sure the coil wasn't broken. Now, what happened is everyone who worked in that factory went crazy. They went mad. The stress of this job and of following this spiral in or out was just too much. And sent everyone completely crazy, except for one man. One man was able to continue doing this job of checking whether the mosquito coil was broken, day in, day out, and to find a sense of joy in doing so. And the reporter in Lunig's parable comes up and he says, well, I'm just really curious. Everyone working in this mosquito coil factory checking whether the coils are broken has lost the plot, except you. How do you do it? And this man responded, he said, look, it's very simple, really. I start out on the outer end of the mosquito coil, and then I go in. And then I take the next one, and I start on the inside, and then I go out. I alternate. I go in, and then I go out. And for me, this is a kind of parable about jihad. Because the heart of jihad, as Salam said, jihad is about struggle. The greater jihad, as you will discover in Dave's book, I'm sure many of you are already familiar, the heart of jihad is about a willingness to transform yourself, a willingness to deal with the violence, the prejudice, the hardness of heart that we all have in ourselves. That's a journey in. But it doesn't stop there. It's also a journey back out, a willingness to engage in the non-violent transformation of the world, a willingness to practice justice. And that's why I say my hope is that if you're not already, that this book might invite you to consider jihad as your newest vocation. And in writing this, Dave is like a kind of archaeologist. He uncovers hidden history. He reveals deep spiritual insights and gives us a way forward to work together to both change ourselves and resist empire. And with that note, read this book and go forth and wage jihad. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. And like Jason said, the first couple of chapters are really, they really take you back. When I first read the first chapter, I was so overwhelmed. I started crying. I was like, at last, a Christian said the truth. So, because I never hear Christians talking about the atrocities that were done by the name of their religion. So that was a big thing for me. So thank you. Thank you for saying the truth. Thank you so much. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, praise be to God, the cherisher and the sustainer of the worlds. O Lord, we have come together tonight from different backgrounds, creeds, and religions, so that we may know one another. Fill us with Fill us with reconciling spirit of your presence, so that we may join one another to do good and build a better humanity. O Lord, lead us to the path of hope, compassion, mercy, love, and peace. Let us pray that all living beings realize that they are all brothers and sisters, all nourished from the same source of life. Peace be with you, peace be with you, peace be with all of you. Amen. Thank you all for coming, and please put your hands together for Dave Andrews, and please buy his book.